discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello everyone, I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Welcome to Another View. Later in the show, we have some information on 2 events happening in our community that you will want to attend. But first, let's talk about the U.S. Census, the 2010 census. Hopefully you've received yours by now. And if you check out question number 9, it asks for the race of person number 1. And the second choice is Black, African American, or Negro. Negro has been added into the census again because so many people hand wrote in that choice in the 2000 census. So what's in a name? Why does the proper title of our race keep changing? And how does that play on the psyche of our people? To help us understand is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University, Clarence Wilson, president of the York, James City County, Williamsburg NAACP, ODU Psychology Professor Dr. Janis Sanchez-Hucles, and Domenick Epps, president of Team Jesus Music Group. Welcome to the program, everyone. How you doing this evening?
Thank you.
Good. Now, I have to tell you, during my research for this show, I was talking with my mother, and we realized something that I think is indicative of what we're talking about. My mother was born in 1936. She was colored on her birth certificate. My sister and I was born in 57. My sister was born in 61. We were both Negro. My daughter was born in 82. She was Black. And my granddaughter was born in 2009. She's African American. And so each place. So from a historical perspective, Cassandra, what's that all about?
Well, you know, starting back in the 16th and actually 15th centuries, you had Europeans going over to Africa and trading with the many different people, especially on the West Coast. And many of them started just simply describing the people based on their color. So you had the Portuguese referring to the Africans as Negros, while the British later on, somewhere around the late 15th, early 16th centuries, or even a little bit later, kind of went back to Roman times and simply referred to them as Africans. Of course, the slave traders referred to the different Africans often by their ethnic group as opposed to homogenizing it.
You mean what tribe they came from?
Exactly.
In Africa?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it really wouldn't be until you would start to see a system of slavery and of the slave trade emerge that you would start to see at least in the public government documents this homogeneous reference to Africans either as Negroes or as Negros or as simply Africans. And then by the time you came to this country and the emergence of this nation, you would see the continued use of the word Negro instead of African. And of course the English had different pronunciations. In fact, most people don't realize it was not until the 19th century that you had a standardization with Webster's dictionary of both spelling and pronunciation of certain words. And so Negro had different phonetic pronunciations from Negar to,
Negro.
I see you guys nodding, so you're familiar with this, Clarence.
Right.
Oh, yes.
In terms of the different pronunciations and the meanings behind.
Yes. And in fact, I think that's one of the big issues is what's in a name, because I think in many cases the name is used to denigrate the race. So you take Negro and it morphs into the N-word, and all of those are disempowering words. And so when you talk about what's in a name, you also ask, well, why is that name here? And in many cases, it appears to be a way of putting you in your place, so to speak.
Because really, we didn't start naming ourselves as a group, and am I correct? Correct me if I'm wrong historically, but mainly until the 60s when we were really starting to talk about Black pride and about
with James
taking
Brown.
pride in what was going on as opposed to
Can I go
names.
back
Sure, absolutely.
Actually, blacks started naming themselves even earlier. I mean, you can see in some of the records of the 17th century, there were some who refused to be called a Negro, they refused to be called a servant, they refused, and they only went by either their name that they had had been given to them or that they crafted for themselves, or by their own ethnic group. You would see a loss of a lot of that by the end of the 18th century, but then when you start to see large numbers of blacks become free and defining themselves as a community, the first word that they started using was African. So you think about the African Methodist Episcopal Church, because their desire was to identify themselves as African, not
from their heritage.
Right, from their heritage, in part because American society by that time had decided that blacks could not assimilate. And so rather than be cast aside, they said, well, we will define ourselves. And so you would see that, you would see colored coming into use, so people of color. You would see Ethiopian come into use, because interestingly, the Europeans started designating that whole corridor that goes from the West Coast all the way to where Ethiopia exists as Ethiopia or Abyssinia. And so many Africans or African Americans began to identify themselves in that way as a way of defining themselves. And then by the 1830s, you started to see some using the term Afro-American. So even though we're current with those terms in the 20th century, they had their origins much earlier.
Domenick, as a young person, younger person on this group, but I'm not going to put it out there. That's right. I'm going to be careful. But from your perspective, do you care, first of all, what you're called, and secondly, which moniker do you take on?
It's yes and no. Yes, I care, and yes, I don't. I'm gonna give y'all a. You all gonna laugh because my wife laughed. I went to Lowe's. Me and a friend of mine, we went to pick up some paint, all right? And we got to the black paint section. And it says, the color said black/Negro, right? And we both looked at each other like, I cannot believe they got black and Negro for paint, right? So I can't wait to get home and share my wife. I cannot wait to get home and tell her this. And knowing I'm coming on the show to talk about this, right? And she says, that's what black is called in Spanish. It blew. Now, it goes to what you were talking about, you know, basically it's a lack of information, lack of knowledge. Because I did not know that, you know, immediately my thought process was, how dare they? You know, but when I received the proper information and the meaning behind the name, then I relaxed some, you know. So to a lot of us, it's basically who's saying it. Let's just be real about it, you know, because we have called ourselves so many different names. From using the N-word in every song you basically hear on television, on the radio. And so with us, it's not really about what you're being called, is who calling you the name that you're being called.
And who's saying it?
That's what was so interesting with James Brown. In the 70s, when he talked about "Say It Loud," I'm black and I'm proud,
yes.
I think that really galvanized a lot of reaction, because it was the first time that we were able to name ourselves.
And embrace it.
Right.
And embrace
so I
it.
think that's very important for the people to come up with a name for themselves, and I think that's what black did. And I think we had that term for a while, and then we moved into African. We had Afro-American first, and then people started talking about African Americans. And I think African American made sense because we had Latin Americans, you know, we had Italian Americans, Native Americans. So it seemed as though we were being consistent. But you know, you and I talked a little bit about the fact that I think we're now in a dilemma, because in my writing, when I try to write about people of color in the United States, the term African American is not appropriate, because that term,
it's not all inclusive.
It doesn't fit the Caribbeans, it doesn't fit people from Central America, for South America. So I'm starting to revert to using the term black to describe people in my writing, because it's more inclusive.
And I made a speech last year, because last year was the 100th anniversary of the NAACP, and we've kind of traced its origin back. And I found as I went through the speech, I was going back and forth between African American and black, and I stepped back and I said, why is that? There were certain instances where black really captured the thought, and there were other times where perhaps in a more formal setting, African American was the right terminology. But it made me a little uneasy to think that there were those two terms there, and I had to pick and choose each time which one I wanted to use.
You were going to use. Now, the other issue also is that Africans today who come over and become U.S. citizens, are they the true African Americans, or because there's that argument that's
an interesting topic, because black Africans, black skinned Africans. We have white Africans. So if they come to America, will they be called African American? Certainly not. You know, they will be called white.
Yes.
Because of their skin color. And we also understand that even the white Africans, they are not from Africa. They was placed there either by Dutch or French. They took over that land, but still, being that they are from Africa today, if they come to become an American citizen, they would not be called an African American, though their descent would say African. You know, I'm from Africa. You know, and that's very interesting. So we still go back to the color of our skin.
Right.
What color are you? You know, if you're light skinned, you're black. Regardless of if you have a white father or a white mother and a black father, you still consider black.
I was going to say, do you any guess on how the president might fill out his census form?
Black.
You think
African
He
American?
does consider himself black.
Right,
Yes.
right. He does.
And we do, because when we see someone that's dark skinned and they have reached a certain level, you know, we put them on this pedestal. That's a black man.
That's
you
an
know.
exactly.
Now,
whether they want to be identified
there you go.
or not.
Right.
Tiger Woods is a prime example.
Exactly.
You know, he did not want to consider himself black, but we say, hey, he's the first black, you know, great golf player.
But he doesn't consider himself black. He came up with the term Cablinasian
Right.
to describe his races. But he is very sensitive about racial identification. So I think even though black people identify with him and his achievements, I think that he doesn't really deal with putting himself into a particular box.
Box. But Janis, overall, from a psychological perspective, what does this do to the general psyche of our people as we're trying to go through, and any of you can answer this, but as you're trying to identify who you are and take pride in who you are, what does that do to us, because we have so many?
I think it poses a lot of challenges. I think the first thing that's really important in terms of identifying with a race is to be able to feel as though you helped select the term. And I think that's one of the reasons why the term Negro was never a term that I felt comfortable with. I know it's the black in Spanish, but I felt like it was appropriated to us. And I never felt very comfortable. I think when the terms Afro-American and African-American came up, I felt like that was going in the right direction. But I think that we want to be able to say, this is who we are, this is a term that we feel comfortable about. But I think right now we don't have one term, because there are people who don't want to be called Negro, there are people who don't want to be called black, there are some people who really like being called colored. Okay?
Right. And they don't want to be called African American.
The broader terms, people of color, does make sense. But I think we really have a dilemma on the part of people of color right now, because I don't think we have a term for those of us who trace our origins to the black race.
Do you think it's generational?
I think it is. For example, in pre-60s, colored was a very acceptable thing, and many older Americans still will not embrace black today.
Because that was such a derogatory term.
It was a derogatory term that in the 40s and 50s, if you were black, that was the worst thing in the world. So
Domenick's going, wow.
Well, absolutely. And so, yes, but to me, if I look at the personal view of that, I want a term that is mine. It took me a while to say, well, black. I mean, it grabbed me at first, but you know, it's kind of still hanging on with the Negro. But once I embraced black, it was the only term that seemed to fit. I still have not gravitated fully to African American. It's a nice formal term, but it doesn't seem to really grasp me as a person.
Right.
Yeah. So
the generational gap, that is where the problem exists, because your generation or other generations embrace African American. Some have embraced black.
Exactly.
Well, you have a younger generation that embrace nigger. You know, and they put a Z at the end to make it very slang.
Right.
Well, they embrace that. But when a generation stands up and say, man, how dare you use that term and all that we went through, well, it's because they have embraced that term within our culture.
Exactly.
Anyone outside of our culture using that term, a red flag goes up and it's time to fight, you know. Right. But that's a problem, that's an issue, because it says that our culture as a whole, we have yet defined who we are, and because of that, we still have separation among ourselves.
Right.
But, you know, I have to step in on this.
Sure.
You know, a lot of young people want to use the N-word as a way of of demarcating themselves. And I've heard all the arguments about, well, I'm not using it in a derogatory way, or I'm trying to appropriate it to something positive, or reappropriate it to something positive. But the reality is that what most young people are doing today in our mass consumer society is using the old stereotypes, because these are the young people who are brought up on Good Times. They're brought up on all these shows that whip out the mammy stereotypes, the urban coon or the samba or whatever, and they don't see these images. All they see are these comedic characters, but these are stereotypic images that have their roots.
They don't have the background.
They don't have the background.
They don't have the historical background to understand.
Daddy Rice, for instance, like Jim Crow. You know, a lot of young people don't even know where the name came from. You know,
Oh, no.
a lot of us grew up thinking it was an actual, a man named Jim Crow. You know, and not understanding the, comedian that really
popularized that image.
There you go. You know,
we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to get this question out. So, if we're as a society, as a group, struggling with what to call ourselves, and people have different names that they're comfortable with, so what do we tell white people? I mean, honestly, what do they call us?
So that they can be comfortable. Let a black person define who they are, rather than somebody wanting to define them. One of the problems with these categories is this desire by American society to shove blacks within a certain realm of control. So if I can call you black, regardless of your ancestry, regardless of how you perceive yourself, then I have control over you. And so Americans have to really, and the world has to really step back away from that 400-year policy of trying to pigeonhole people of African descent and allow those individuals to define themselves.
I was going to say, one of the greatest compliments to me was in my early working terms. One of my managers came when the black Negro issue was, and he asked me, "So what do you want me to call you?"
See, that made you feel good and empowered.
I felt great. I selected, and from then on, that's how we related. So,
if you come into the therapy room, I do not assume that I know your race.
Right.
I ask you, what is your racial background? Because with a lot of people, you cannot tell what race they are. So I let people tell me, what term would you like me to use?
And what do they normally say to you? Well, I mean, I know you see a variety of people, but
well, sometimes I'm really surprised. Wow. There are often people that I assume are white who tell me that they have a black parent and a white parent, and they tell me that they consider themselves both. And a lot of families really struggle with this issue, and a lot of times they don't talk about this issue. But I think it's really important to ask individuals, what designation do you want me to use for you?
Because even within a family,
there are different designations.
Could be different designations, even within a family. Yeah. Domenick, what would you say if a white person said, well, what do I call you? How do you relate to that?
I'm okay with black. I'm okay with African American. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I would rather them look at me and say, okay, well, he's a man of God. Don't define me by my color. Define me by the characteristics that I portray, and that's what I would like for people to remember me as, besides, oh, he was a black man, or he was an African American, oh man, he was also a man of God that lived on the earth. That's for me. I can't say everyone speaks that way, but personally, because either or, it doesn't really define me. What you call me, what defines me is how I live, and so.
I think the hard part is that people tend not to do that. I think that even though that's what you stand for and that's what you want, I think one of the most visibly characteristic aspects of our being is our race.
You are defined.
And if you go up and say to somebody, ask them questions, they'll say, if referring to you, they'll say, oh, that black guy.
That's right.
I mean, that's one of the first things they'll say is your racial background.
That's right.
And as I tried to explain to a former boss, was when I walk into a room and I am the only person of color, I stand out. I mean, you can't help but stand out, because that's the way it is. I wish we could continue this conversation, but we are out of time. Thank you all
so
much.
Thank
you. This has been a very, very good discussion about this. And when we come back, we'll go behind the scenes of an American classic, A Raisin in the Sun. But first, here's what's happening in Hampton Roads. When it played on Broadway in 1959, A Raisin in the Sun was nominated for 4 Tony Awards. Now, more than 50 years later, this popular piece of American theater is engaging audiences again, this time right here in Hampton Roads. Our Lisa Godley takes us behind the scenes as the cast prepares for opening night.
I just seen my family falling apart today. Just falling apart in pieces in front of my eyes. We couldn't have gone on like we was today. We was going backwards instead of forwards, talking about killing babies and wishing each other was dead. When it gets like this in life, you got to do something different. Push on out and do something bigger. I wish you would say something, son. I wish you would say how deep inside you think I've done the right thing.
What you need me to say you done the right thing? You the head of this family. And you run our lives like you want. It was your money and you did what you wanted with it. So what you need me to say it was all right for? So you butchered up a dream of mine. You, who always talking about your children's dreams.
Walter Lee.
Powerful scenes like this one is how A Raisin in the Sun has captivated audiences for the past 5 decades. This engaging masterpiece gives audiences an up-close look at the African-American experience. While the play is set in Southside Chicago in the mid-1950s, many believe it's as relevant in 2010 as it was when it opened. Actress Elaine Graham, who plays Lena in the Virginia Stage Company's production, agrees. She says this is a must-see, especially for children.
Bring them and let them be a part of history and to see what life was like back then, to see what a lot of people had to go to so that they can have what they have now, and why it is so important to get your education.
Some of the same desires, we may go about them a different way now, but the drive, the passion, the family unit, how we relate to each other as family members, the arguing, but it's still the love that's still there. Then I say it loud and good. Hallelujah! Goodbye, misery. And I don't ever want to see your ugly face again.
A Raisin in the Sun originally opened in Broadway in 1959. The cast included Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee, and it won the Best Play of the Year citation. It was revived in 2004 on Broadway and later turned into a made-for-TV movie. Now Hampton Roads audiences will have a chance to see it for themselves here at the historic Wells Theater in Norfolk. Unlike performances at many other theaters where the set and cast travel from city to city as one unit, the Wells offers a different experience. The sets are built right here in the theater, and cast members come from all over the country, forming a unique little family for the length of the production. Wendell Franklin is the only member of the cast who has played his character before. He portrays Walter Lee, who he describes as a complex man.
He's a man who has dreams, as many men during that time did, but unfortunately didn't have the opportunities to actually realize those dreams. So,
over the years, critics have described A Raisin in the Sun as the first accurate portrayal of the African-American experience and as a play that changed American theater forever. Director Chris Hanna agrees.
Raisin in the Sun is my very favorite play, and probably, I think, the best written American play ever.
There's been a whole lot of sunlight.
Yes, child. There's a whole lot of sunlight.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
A Raisin in the Sun is Virginia Stage Company's contribution to Minds Wide Open, Virginia's statewide celebration of women in the arts. It runs March 30th through April 18th at the historic Wells Theater in downtown Norfolk. Now, there are two events that I want to bring to your attention this weekend. This is National Youth Violence Prevention Week, and the folks in Hampton are having a gang prevention and family wellness resource fair. It's Saturday from 9 to 3 at First Baptist Church of Hampton. There will be lots of resources to help families fight against youth violence, including workshops and a community forum entitled "Should Athletes and Hip-Hop Artists Serve as Role Models in Our Youth's Lives?" The second event is the Prostate Health Forum Awareness and Education Workshops that will also be held on Saturday the 27th. There are 2 sessions, 8 to noon and 1 to 5. And you will learn the latest in treatment options and research on prostate cancer. It's for men and for women, and you can register on site. Call 827-0488 to let them know that you are coming. I will be there, and I hope that you will come too. And by the way, both of these events are free. And finally, it's census time. Please remember to fill out and return your census. The official census day is April 1st. And that's our show for this evening. Next week, pop culture and the African American community. We'll see you next time for another view.